Okay, let's just jump right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving headfirst into a literal financial detective story. We're talking about one of the most enduring mysteries in modern economics. So, the United States government claims to hold this massive, world-leading hoard of gold, right? It's the supposed bedrock of global financial confidence. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. No one from the outside has truly independently verified that this gold is actually sitting in those vaults in decades, literally decades. So today, we're putting on our investigative journalist hats. We're going to tear into the official numbers, track the historical paper trail, and look at some frankly bizarre modern movements of gold to ask one very simple, very crucial question. Is it actually there? To even wrap our heads around the scale of this mystery, we've got to start with this number, 8,100. That's the amount, in metric tons, of physical gold the U.S. government claims to have locked away in heavily guarded vaults right this very second. This treasure has been the stuff of American myth for generations, right? It conjures up those classic images of impenetrable, laser-grade fortresses like Fort Knox. Okay, so let's dive into this. On paper, the government values this staggering amount of metal at around $11 billion. But for years, there's been this persistent, highly skeptical question echoing through financial circles. Is America's $11 billion stash actually there? Are we relying on hard, verifiable evidence here? Or are we all just operating on a massive, globally accepted system of trust me, bro? Well, the very first major discrepancy in the official story hits us right smack in the accounting books. Get this. The government values its gold stash using an official book value that is set at exactly $42.22 per ounce. That price hasn't been updated since the 1970s. Because the government absolutely refuses to mark to market, which just means they won't update the ledger to reflect current prices, that $11 billion figure is just wildly, almost laughably outdated. If we look at today's actual market realities, this gold would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, what's really fascinating is exactly where this immense wealth is supposedly kept. Almost half of the country's total gold, that's 4,580 tons, is said to be stored in the Fort Knox Bullion Depository in Kentucky. Then the remaining balance is split between the U.S. Mint and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So we're dealing with a highly concentrated and honestly incredibly secretive storage network. So how did America even get all this gold? It's a crazy story of massive accumulation followed by a sudden rug pull. Back in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt controversially required citizens to literally turn in their private gold for paper dollars. Then, as World War II loomed, European nations started shipping their gold to the U.S. for safekeeping. This pushed U.S. reserves to an absolute peak of over 20,000 tons by 1941. That immense wealth is what allowed the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement to peg the U.S. dollar directly to gold. But then, 1971 rolls around, President Nixon abruptly ends the dollar's convertibility into gold, effectively trapping whatever was left straight inside those vaults. And that brings us to an absolutely crucial piece of financial plumbing that honestly most people completely misunderstand. The Federal Reserve, America's own central bank, doesn't actually own any physical gold. None. Zero. Since 1934, all the physical gold was turned over to the U.S. Treasury. So what does the Fed hold instead? They hold a gold certificate. It's essentially just a paper IOU sitting on the Fed's balance sheet. It represents that outdated $11 billion book value, while the actual physical metal supposedly sits quietly over in the Treasury's vaults. Naturally, whenever you have this level of extreme government secrecy combined with hundreds of billions of dollars locked behind closed doors, rumors are going to rush in to fill the void. And man, the theories out there are wild. Some claim President Lyndon B. Johnson secretly shipped tons of it to London back in the 60s. Others argue, sure, the gold is there, but it actually belongs to foreign nations now. There are claims it's been secretly swapped or leased out to big banks, and perhaps the most infamous theory, which was championed by figures like former Congressman Ron Paul, suggests those vaults might just be filled with counterfeit, tungsten-plated bricks that perfectly mimic the density and weight of real gold. No way to know for sure, right? Which leads us to the most obvious question in the world. If these conspiracy theories are complete nonsense, if it's all just tinfoil hat stuff, why doesn't the government just open the vault doors, invite in some independent auditors, and just prove it? Economists will quickly argue the government has zero incentive to lie, because obviously a scandal of that magnitude would be catastrophic. But look, a lack of transparency absolutely breeds skepticism.
Now, officials will frequently stand up and claim, hey, the gold is audited. But when you meticulously pick apart that paper trail, a very, very different picture emerges. In 1953, the Eisenhower administration did a limited spot check. We're talking just 5 to 7% of the gold. Then, in 1974, they hosted this 2-hour PR tour for the media and politicians. Fast forward to 1975, the Government Accountability Office started doing partial checks that lasted until 1981, and the most recent so-called proof? A VIP visit by the Treasury Secretary in 2017.
Let's look a little closer at that 1974 media tour, because it was specifically designed to silence the doubters once and for all. They let in 100 congressmen and journalists. They were allowed to snap some photos, even hold the bars. One radio reporter literally went on air and reported with a bit of a shrug, well, all I can say is that I saw gold in there. But here is exactly what they didn't do. They didn't test a single bar for purity. They didn't weigh them. And they definitely didn't check a single serial number against the official Treasury records. It was just pure, unfiltered public relations.
And even when the government actually tried to be systematic about it, they fell incredibly short. Between 1975 and 1981, the General Accounting Office and the U.S. Mint did conduct partial yearly audits. But get this, even at the end of that entire multi-year program, they'd only verified about 80% of the ounces. And even more shockingly, only 21% of the actual gold bars were checked by their specific serial numbers. And since 1981, the audits have been entirely internal, based on a system of administrative trust. Fast forward all the way to 2017. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin takes this highly publicized trip down to Fort Knox. He steps out, gets on his phone, and tweets, "Glad the gold is there." Now, sure, that's a fun moment for social media, but come on. Relying on a politician's passing comment after a VIP tour is a massive far cry from demanding an independent, bar-by-bar public audit. But our investigation doesn't just stop at historical audits, because there's a startling modern clue that has recently reignited panic across the financial sector. We're going to call it the Great Gold Migration. Right now, massive amounts of physical wealth are suddenly moving across the Atlantic, and honestly, it's making people incredibly nervous. Specifically, the data shows that banks are currently flying roughly 8,000 gold bars straight out of vaults in London and directly into New York. That represents about 2% of the entire U.S. official total, just moving all at once. For the deep skeptics out there, this is it. This is the smoking gun. They argue that the U.S. must be quietly replenishing completely empty vaults at Fort Knox. But actually, scratch that. The reality is deeply rooted in some pretty complex banking mechanics. To cut through the noise and the conspiracy theories, we need to understand a very specific financial mechanism, arbitrage. This is essentially a banking strategy, where market makers buy an asset in one market and simultaneously sell it in another, just to profit from a price difference. And it turns out this is the real reason these gold bars are suddenly taking flight.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this plays out in real time. Because of geopolitical tensions and tariff uncertainty, the price of gold in New York spiked about $20 higher per ounce than over in London. Big banks regularly sell gold futures in New York to hedge their risks. But when that New York price suddenly spiked, those bets, their short positions, started losing massive amounts of money. So to stop bleeding cash, the banks are literally putting physical gold on cargo airplanes to New York so they can settle those futures contracts at the higher price and finally close out their losses.
And we are not talking about a small-scale operation here either. JP Morgan alone is reportedly moving over $4 billion worth of gold across the Atlantic just to execute this arbitrage play. It really demonstrates that this massive migration is a highly calculated emergency banking maneuver to fix their own ledgers. It's not definitive proof that the U.S. government is scrambling in the dead of night to refill an empty Fort Knox.
But here is what you really need to take away from this explainer today. While we can mathematically and logically explain the current gold flights from London, the United States government's persistent, stubborn refusal to allow independent audits is still a massive, lingering liability. If the unthinkable were true and the gold was somehow missing or compromised, the fallout would be nothing short of apocalyptic. We would see an overnight collapse of the U.S. dollar's credibility. We're talking spiraling hyperinflation, an unprecedented global financial panic, and an immediate, desperate rush by foreign nations to demand entirely new gold-backed currencies. As long as the government relies on a policy of trust me rather than providing actual transparent proof, this mystery is going to endure. I mean, even tech billionaires are publicly calling to just live stream the vaults. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought.
In a global economy that is entirely dependent on the perceived strength of the American dollar, if the gold is really gone, how long could the financial system actually survive the illusion? Thanks for joining me for this investigation, and keep questioning what's really behind those vault doors.